I'm going to get started with the second panel on managing oil price uncertainty and the energy transition. We're going to hear Hani Abdel Latif present the IMF chapter, and then my colleague Rob Weiner will provide discussion remarks. Both of those will take place from the podium, and then we'll again convene for our discussion portion.
Great, excellent.
Hani, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Sure everything is working, and just have something to say before I start. The same team prepared both presentation, but the first one is much more beautiful. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to present our work today. I will, as mentioned, I'm going to talk about managing oil price uncertainty and the energy transition in Sub-Saharan Africa. So our focus today would be on the 8 countries that are oil exporters, and the way we define oil exporters, that those countries that have the oil is about 30% or more of total exports. So we have 8 countries in the region. When we look at how much they depend on fiscal revenues from oil, we'll see that on average, we have 60% from fiscal revenues come from oil, and this is a comparable. This is comparable to oil exporters in other regions. So, in times of high oil prices, so these countries or policymakers of those countries have many or several trade-offs. So, in regard with what to do with these oil revenues, how much should they save? How much should they spend? And the same answer, like the same question, similar question about when they spend, like how much, what to spend on, and the same thing with saving is basically how to allocate these savings between building assets and reducing debt. So what we try to do here, we try to look at the past, and as we know that oil prices swing up and down, and that's why we believe that these countries should save enough when oil prices are high. So when in the time when oil prices fall, then they can smooth out spending. So basically, we don't have disruption to their spending during low oil prices. We also, or ideally, we should see their fiscal policy in the form of government spending and taxes moving in opposite direction with the business cycle. That means when private demand is too low or not sufficient, then the government can step in and increase government spending and cut taxes so they can put the economy back in track. And of course, the opposite should happen when the private demand is outpacing the capacity of the economy. So we say like the economy is running too hot, then the government will step in by following or adopting a tighter fiscal policy, meaning basically cutting spending and increasing taxes. So again, to stabilize the economy. So this is what we call counter-cyclical fiscal policy. But when it comes to our experience in the region here, we looked at what happened since 2000 to 2019. We found that actually this hasn't been the case. So first, in terms of savings, they didn't save enough. So more than 100% of their oil revenue were spent over this time. So two, we found that the way that fiscal policy works is actually, it's very tightly, closely moving with the business cycle. So again, well, what we see here is that, or the result or the outcome of this sort of policies is that one, we find that the growth in those countries is 2 percentage points lower than, that's an average, of course, compared to other countries in the region. And also that will raise some debt sustainability concerns, as you will see. So when we say they haven't, so this is just looking at the past, looking at historical data. So now The question is, I just said that they didn't save enough. So I guess a natural question would be, then how much should they save? So this is the second question, or the second point I want to cover in this presentation. We wanted to estimate the minimum level of savings that they would need to ensure against oil price declines in the future. So what we did here, we found that for this group of countries, 8 oil exporting countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, we found that they would need, ideally, they would need about 5 to 10% of their GDP to ensure against oil price shocks over 3-year period. And if you want to translate for how long they can accumulate this, to translate this to annual surplus, we found that it's something in the range of 1% of their GDP. But they need to do this consistently over a 10-year period to be able to build required savings or buffers so they can ensure against future shocks. Is this something reasonable? Looking at the data again, looking in the past, yes, it is reasonable. It is within reach, but however, we found that fiscal surpluses have been too low to achieve that. Okay, so now let's assume they have enough savings. It comes a question, I mean, they don't have enough savings, but let's say now they decide to save enough. Okay, the question, or a natural question will come up with, okay, how are they going to allocate these savings? So there are, this is a very difficult question, but there are two ways they can think about this. So they either can accumulate assets. So then when an oil price shock happens, then they can use those assets to ensure against the shock, to smooth out spending, or they can reduce debt. So basically, they just free some room for more borrowing. Okay, in the future, again, if oil prices are low. But when we look at the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, we found that the number of countries that are already in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress has been rising compared to 10 years ago. And also, we know from our previous research that the cost of borrowing and oil prices are moving actually in the opposite direction, meaning that in time of low oil prices, it becomes more expensive to borrow for these countries, and even some countries even lose access to markets. So based on this, we actually recommend in the report that for countries that debt sustainability is a concern, then they probably should use those savings from oil revenues to reduce their debt levels. Okay, and of course, elsewhere, when debt concerns are not very concerning, then they could build buffers or build assets. So this is the question to do with, okay, we know they're not saving enough. How much should they save? And then how should they allocate savings? But I just have to say that the answer to this question has to be country specific. There are so many factors at play here. So you need to look at the cost of borrowing, you need to look at return on asset, you need to look at how different shocks affect these countries. But generally speaking, that's what we recommend in the report. So basically, depending on the debt status and how debt is concerning, so that is the course of action. So then we move to a very important, factor that affect those countries, or at least we know that will affect those countries in the future, which is climate change and the energy transition. So as the world moves to a more greener energy, then that means less demand on fossil fuels. Okay, and that means these revenues, they depend on oil revenues. There will be less demand. That means prices will fall, and then their revenues will fall. So in the literature, we also know from the literature that the oil demand peak is not too far into the future. I think there's a consensus that there's one day that day will come when oil is not as important as it is today. Okay, so I think the only disagreement in the literature is actually when in the future this will happen, but everyone agreed that this will happen at some point. So we did some simulation here based on some assumptions, like a scenario by the IEA, and we found that for our countries, for our 8 countries in the region, we expect that their revenues will fall by 50% by 2050. So the message is that they need to be ready for that. Okay, so we know this has been going for a long time. The idea of they need diversification, they need to move away from fossil fuel, but it's they have to move now. They have to try to decrease their dependence on fossil fuel. So again, what should they do then? So this will take me to the last part of my presentation, which is the policy recommendation, what we recommended in our report. So the first, I didn't talk about spending at all. So as I said initially, that the trade-offs here actually is not only on the saving side, maybe my presentation focus only on the saving side, but also they need to look into the spending side. So on the spending side, one important thing, they need to actually improve the spending efficiency. When we look at the quality of their infrastructure, is the lowest in the world. We looked at when we look at social benefit system, it's actually not working as it should be. So one of the indicators we highlighted in the report is that the poorest 20% of the population receive only 6% of social benefits. I mean, that's compared to 12% elsewhere in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not saying 12% is a great number, but at least that highlights how bad the situation is in terms of the need to reform these systems. Also, subsidy reform, they spend about 2.5% of GDP on subsidies. And when you think about these subsidies, as my colleagues highlighted earlier, these are untargeted subsidies. Okay, so basically you're supporting the wrong group. You're supporting the rich, not the poor. Okay, so these are like one of the main policy recommendations in our report. And as you can expect, when we talk about they need to save and how much they save, I guess this has to be by adopting medium-term budget frameworks, which involve accumulating assets or savings, and accumulating assets also reducing them. Of course, the transition is not only a threat; it also offer opportunities. And what we saw in the region is rich with minerals that are needed for the transition. So, so they should exploit the new opportunities that the energy transition offer, and the old this has been there for forever, like the need to transform the economies away from fossil fuels. So in the past we talk about how it affects their growth, how to make it very volatile, but now actually there's something more coming. There's the energy transition, so you really need to be prepared to move away from fossil fuel. And of course, improving governance, institution, and business environment. This is something has been covered in the previous presentation as well. And that will take me to, or let me conclude by saying that international support is also important. Okay, so these countries may not have the technology, okay, to move to renewables. Then we need support. They need international support. Okay, so this is something very, very important, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I just wanted to say this is a joint work with my colleagues here, Chan, Ivanova, and Henry, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. I'll now invite my colleague Bob Weiner to come present his discussion remarks.
All right, thank you for the opportunity. Thanks to IIB and thanks to all of you for coming today and taking time out of your busy schedule to sit back and think a little bit about where the world is going. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the oil price uncertainty. So I'm a professor of economics and finance, and so I don't know much about the transition, so I'm going to leave off the part about the transition. All my students are mostly interested in the transition, and I tell them by the time the transition takes place, I'll be retired or dead or both. So let's proceed from here. Now, in terms of the term living on the edge, very catchy for their REO, oil exporters are always living on the edge. And so the term living on the edge really is not terribly full of content here. Question is, which edge? When times are good and oil prices are high, there is a natural incentive to squander the money. And you heard Hani talk about how they spent more than 100% in boom times. When times are bad, then they have to cut back and affect society in a number of different ways. So oil exporters are always on the edge. in terms of the basic advice, we used to joke when we were talking about the IMF in the old days that the IMF's advice to every country is export more and import less and not worry about the adding up condition. And this is sort of the same advice that the IMF always gives. The idea that we should save for a rainy day or reduce fuel subsidy, that's not very controversial. It doesn't depend on oil prices or whether we're living on the edge or not. It's good advice, but it's not really reflecting what's going on. In terms of the REO's point estimates for GDP growth, fiscal balance, when you realize how uncertain oil prices are, it's not clear that these are really all that valuable. And one thing that we might do is, given uncertainty, is in the REO, there might be a chart that says, all right, let's take 2 standard deviations above and below the IMF expected price, and let's see what the GDP growth estimates and the fiscal balance estimates would look like. Because 2 standard deviations actually is quite large because of the uncertainty about oil price. And if you want to get a sense of how uncertain oil prices are, roughly speaking, the volatility is about 50% per year, which is huge. If you compare that with exchange rates, when exchange rates are in volatile times, exchange rates volatility is 10% per year. In ordinary times, exchange rates are 5%. So we're talking about, compared to ordinary times, exchange rates about 10 times more volatile in terms of standard deviation for future prices. If you want to look at what the market consensus is, the black line here shows past oil price. And the purpose of this is to give you a sense of the challenge that these countries face, a challenge that does not really appear in the REO, or at least if it did. I should say I read the little supplement that Honey's presentation is based on. I didn't read the whole REO. You don't really get a sense of how challenging or difficult the time is. And so if you look at this, this is basically current data. The dark line shows past prices of oil prices, and you can see that oil prices since 2020 have ranged from less than $20 a barrel to almost $120 a barrel. And so the idea that, well, in this time period, these oil exporters had 2% lower growth than other sub-Saharan African countries, I don't think it really tells you very much. Because if you took some other 2-year period where oil prices were maybe higher, maybe lower, that number might be quite different. If you look ahead, because after all, this is an outlook, the green line, the up and down green lines show you the 95% confidence interval based on oil price forecasting for where the market is going. And there's a 95% chance that if you just take it, for example, the end of next year, since it's not that far away, and we're talking about, after all, we're talking about dealing with fiscal issues, we usually think of 1 year at a time. By the end of next year, there's a 95% chance that the price will be at least $35 a barrel, and at most $185 a barrel. Now, when I show that to my students, they sort of gasp, and I say it's not too late to switch the basket weaving course if you want something kind of nice and stable. But you know that you're forming your budget, and you gotta say I'm 95% sure I get at least $35 a barrel, and 95% sure that I won't get more than $185. That gives you a real sense of how difficult it's going to be, and how little the REO's recommendations really speak to it. You really need to delve within, sort of down from even the forecast about where prices are going. We have 2 lines here. The green line is a market consensus. The green line says, based on expected futures prices, we expect that by the end of next year, the price will fall to $80 per barrel from approximately 90 now. But the folks at the Department of Energy who make up this outlook, they think the price is going to rise. You think, what do they know that the market doesn't? And the answer is probably nothing. But just the fact that the experts disagree with the market consensus give you a sense of the challenge of what's going on. So just go. Okay. In terms of issues, the REO is very focused on macro, since that's what the IMF kind of does. But you know what? When underneath their pricing that spending should be more efficient hides a whole bunch of issues. And so one of the things that's a little surprising that none of these issues are even mentioned for the oil experts, and things that the IMF has done a great job in the past talking about: transparency, oil sector investment, corruption, I couldn't find them in REO. Maybe they don't belong in the REO, but the IMF 10 or 15 years ago did a lot of work on this in terms of advising oil countries on sort of how to do better on the macro by improving the micro. And maybe this stuff like transparency and corruption is a lot more important than sort of, oh, we should save more for a rainy day. And now we now have a period of high oil prices. We don't know how long it's going to last, but it is a good opportunity to get your fiscal house in order. When your house is burning down, it's really hard to plan for the future. When you're getting the money in, it's a good chance to think about the future. The IMF's advice is the same as it was 10 years ago, and basically 15 years ago, and as far as I know, 20 years ago. But the fact that these countries have spent more than 100% of revenue suggests they're not taking the IMF's advice. Nonetheless, the IMF is free to give more advice going forward that looks more or less like past advice. Okay, so it's not that the IMF's advice is wrong. It's always good advice. It just doesn't change depending on whether it's raining or sunny outside. The economic management task is daunting just from looking at uncertainty about future prices. Connie mentioned that the oil exporters in boom times, they spend more than 100% of their oil revenues, and they don't save anything. But let's look at real, these are poor countries. There are needs in health, in education, infrastructure. It's really hard to say, let's put that money in the bank when politicians are saying, what are people doing for it? Similarly, the oil price subsidies, we should reform oil price subsidies. You gotta be kidding me. All countries are subsidizing oil prices, or all costs. In rich countries, the way that it's being done is by reducing their taxes. That's what some governors in the United States are hoping to get reelected and reduce the taxes. And so in effect, increasing the subsidy on gasoline. And all countries pretty much are. It's not very realistic to say we should reform oil price subsidies. It is true that the rich, as I said, the rich benefit more than the poor, but that's because the rich use more oil than the poor. The people who are out demonstrating against the government when they remove the oil price subsidies are not usually the rich, they're the poor. And we've had a lot of dramatic examples. It's a great idea in principle, but it's not very credible. So then what can we do? To just give up? And the one thing that's surprising is that the note mentions that it's not to even think about derivatives, because I know they're complicated, but some countries actually use derivatives. And maybe the only way to avoid the politicians, the leaders getting a big gusher of money when times are good and having to go desperately looking when times are bad is to make sure they don't get the money in the first place. And that's an exaggeration. We don't have to hedge 100%. We hedge some of it will reduce the volatility. And the IMF in the past gave countries good advice about what types of derivatives they might use. So for example, options are a good, very good way to use derivatives because in boom times, you don't give up the upside. You're basically protecting against the downside in return for a fee. And if a country is very poor, then some of the multilaterals might even be able to subsidize this. And so politicians in these countries say, we don't want to hedge because if it turns out ex post that oil prices go up a lot, people will say to us, you gave away the country's patrimony. That's why you shouldn't be using forwards or swaps, but you could use options. And it's a little discouraging that that's not even mentioned in the note, because in some ways that's the only way to get away from asking the managers of these countries' fiscal accounts that, oh, you should be spending less when times are good. It's just given their political incentives, just not very. Just to give you a sense of what some of the real issues are. Investment, lack of investment is a very serious issue for Africa, especially given the current climate. There's just not much investment in the oil sector in Africa at all. And this is a comparison of foreign direct investment per square kilometer between rich countries and poor countries. And it's a little out of date, but the idea is the same. The Lack of investment for Sub-Saharan Africa is a big issue in terms of the declining oil production in many countries. And the reason for lack of investment is not because of good opportunities. You wouldn't think that a square kilometer in Africa should be any less or any more productive in terms of oil and gas than a square kilometer anyplace else. It has to do with some of those micro issues that maybe are that I don't know, hidden under the rug or not mentioned in the REO. Investment is hardly mentioned in the REO at all, and yet lack of investment is critical because this is a depleting resource, and a lot of Africa's oil basins are winding down. If you look at producing oil wells, so if you look, for example, at worldwide numbers, you look at how many oil wells there are. Oil wells is the smallest unit of exploration and smallest unit of capital. Out of the 778,000 oil wells in this chart, 447,000 of them were in North America and 11,000 were in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's an indication that shows about what lack of investment actually looks like. And not too surprisingly, if you look at the reserves that are found per square kilometer, Africa is way below North America. Not because of worth resource, but simply because of lack of investment. If you look at wealth, this is a try to estimate natural resources wealth again. If you look at the wealth per square kilometer, the OECD, $114,000 per square kilometer, and Africa, 23,000. So what happens is we invest less, and so we find less wealth, and we produce less, and that then, of course, hurts the fiscal balance. Okay, so then, just to finish up, the REO has a list of 8 oil countries, but there are other sub-Saharan African countries that are actually potentially affected a lot by petroleum wealth. Perhaps Ghana stands out more because it's made a big difference. They don't show up as much on percentage of contribution to the fisc, but still they're extremely important in terms of the size of these countries' economy. And a lot of these countries already show the corruption and lack of transparency, even though they're not in the REO's list of oils. That's the last. Yeah, that's. I don't have a nice thank you slide, and I don't have any cooperation. As a professor, I don't have anybody to cooperate with. But thank you very much for your attention.
I'll invite you to come and take a seat up at the front, and we'll begin the discussion. So thank you both very much for the presentation and the discussion. We'll open it up to audience questions shortly, as well as to the online questions. But I wanted to start by transitioning back to Hani and asking if you had any quick reflections or additional insights from the report that you wanted to share, and then we'll transition on.
Thank you. Just check that this is working. Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to share a few thoughts on the presentation. I think I have to agree and disagree at the same time. So things I would say I agree with, and others probably disagree. So I guess I already highlighted that yes, there are some of these advice actually has been like there for a while. And the thing is that we just keep emphasizing this, and still we're not there. 5-6 years ago, I was at a conference, and a colleague from the World Bank was citing a report that probably was talking about the need for transformation, diversification. That report goes back when I was like 2-year-old. Okay, so my point is that yes, there's some sort of the same advice keep coming again, subsidy reform, etc. Because it's just not happening. Okay, and it is really important. Okay, and if you think about it, we have a country that depend on oil revenues, and we know that oil revenues. Well, this is not very volatile. So this is something we cannot really rely on. We cannot build a growth. I think this growth model didn't prove to be successful. So I think the answer is just to move away from this model. And now we have the transition is another complication, another challenge for these countries. So I guess the answer is yes, West, we keep repeating that advice, but we just want to keep this forward. And actually, one more thing I actually agree with, in the importance of institutions and governance and fighting corruption. And I think this is something we highlight in the radio, and this is something we did many times in the past, and I can actually give you like some radios that has like dedicated chapters actually on how to do that. And I actually, in fact, something I remember now is that the IMF has published recently a book. I'm just trying to remember the name of the book. It's something to do with good governance in Africa. That was like a few months ago. Okay, so it's actually called Good Governance in Sub-Saharan Africa, which features 3 countries, Botswana, Rwanda, and Seychelles, as leading and their leading efforts on improving governance. So the idea of institutions, again, this is something we do agree with Mr. Roberts on, that these are very important issues. We cover them a lot in different venues, different publications. They came in the radio many times, but again, it's just we need to take. I mean, there are efforts, there's progress. That's what's highlighted in the recent publication by the IMF. But I guess there's more work to be done in this area. One more thing is the lack of subsidy reforms first. I mean, subsidy reforms is obviously the problem is not subsidy reforms itself. Okay, we're not talking about we just don't like subsidy reforms. We are talking about untargeted support. Okay, so when you basically is sponsoring or supporting the rich group. Okay, so the idea, as I highlighted in the presentation, also in the report, is that when you look at like the poorest 20% of the population receiving only 6% of social benefits. So where does the rest go? 94% of the support. So the idea is not subsidies per se. It's mainly the untargeted support. And this is what we're trying to, especially it's very pressing when you have very limited physical space, you don't have resources, scarce resources. So you need to be very pragmatic in the way you design policies to support the poor. So you need to be these need to be very well targeted. The last point, I guess, which is the lack of investment in the oil sector. I guess this is a very important issue. And we know that, given the recent decline, I mean, obviously now oil prices are recovering, but, after 2014, we saw the trend of oil prices going down. And even, one of those who actually wrote and said, okay, this is the end of, that oil era. It's coming to an end, but obviously, still like it's oil still important, I guess. But for how long, we don't really know. But most people, as I highlighted, talking about the oil demand peak, it's going to happen at some point. But oil is not going to be as important as it is today. So they need to prepare. But going back to the investment idea, or the lack of investment in the oil sector, this is a very difficult question, a very tough question, because given what's happening now, given the energy transition, given that we know that oil in one day is not going to be as important, the question is, should we direct these scarce resources into investing in oil, or should we invest in renewables, or like more like greener or cleaner options? Sub-Saharan Africa has like one of the striking facts in Sub-Saharan Africa is like 50% of the population don't have access to electricity. This is like very shocking. So like 50% of millions of people don't have access. So the idea is that, do you really have to follow the old model where I have to use oil or fossil fuels to generate electricity? Or is there any other way that we can leapfrog? We can actually make progress using a new model of clean and renewable energy. I mean, what we highlight in the report, I think, is that the chance is still there, and we could do it. I mean, Sub-Saharan Africa has the potential to benefit from the situation. Of course, there's a threat. Of course, there will be problems for the oil industry, especially, which take me back again to the same point, the lack of investment is still with oil price. Okay, so in Sub-Saharan Africa, we think about, it is important to think about the extraction costs. Is it as the same as those, like, is as low as it is in other countries like the Middle East and North Africa? No, it's not. Okay, so we highlight in the report that those countries with high extraction costs will be hit first by the energy transition. So these just few thoughts, and finally, I think I agree. Like there are other countries affected by oil as well, not only the 8 oil exporters, but we just, in our classification, we just look at those who have, oil represents more than 50% of their export. But of course, I totally agree with Professor Robert in that. So yeah, as you see, like there's some points I agree on, some points I probably don't agree with.
We would expect that.
Thank you.
We'll transition now to questions from the audience. We'll take one from the gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Robert. I would like to defend a little bit the report, even though I'm leading the report. So I think you make an immensely important point in your first slide, which is that oil prices are extremely uncertain, extremely volatile. So the challenge for oil exporters is really to do policy making under high uncertainty. So at the IMF, the solution to this big problem is for us this recommendation that we make to create buffers, in a sense to self-insure against these shocks. And what's new, I think, in this thinking is the fact that now we calibrate this buffer in a very different way. In the past, we used to calibrate them with a PIH, and now we have these stochastic approaches, and we are trying to provide advice to countries on how much buffer they need to accumulate. My feeling, and you have a different view, but that a 5 to 10% GDP buffer is not unrealistic. It's not out of reach of countries, So we're not talking about building 90% of GDP of buffers, which I would agree with you, is totally unrealistic. But what we are showing is that just 5 to 10% of GDP of buffers is enough to already hedge against large shocks. And I think this is a very important message. So regarding your suggestion, I have a few questions. So you mentioned 2 reforms. The first one is transparency. So as Annie mentioned, we believe that transparency is extremely important at the fund. We have actually many publications on that. Very important to reduce waste. But how do you see that as affecting the way countries can address uncertainty? I'm not sure that I see the link and how transparency can help countries with uncertainty. The second is derivatives. So this is extremely interesting, but from my experience, so I'm mission chief also in a country that is not an oil producer, but a diamond producer. But countries are a very limited financial market. Some countries have no very small banking sector. Some have zero capacity on the authority side to manage any financial innovation. Some countries have no insurance system. So which countries, what examples do you have in mind of countries? I'm talking about the low-income one that have succeeded to use derivative in order to manage oil. And it's really a nice question. I don't know any, so if you could please elaborate on that, that would be immensely helpful for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Of course, these are not easy issues, otherwise we wouldn't need to be here talking about them. So on the transparency issue, I think one of the biggest benefits of transparency is on the investment side. And I think this was going to be, because I think Honey made a good point about renewables, but in some sense, I see investment in renewables as not so different from investment in oil. The same reasons that multinationals hesitate to invest in oil in high political risk countries, same for renewables. There are high upfront capital costs, easily expropriated, etc. Transparency, in some sense, will constrain the governments in terms of their negotiations with multinationals, the negotiations with other people. Companies don't like investing in countries with reputations for corruption for good reasons and bad reasons. I mean, some good reasons, like they think that it's important, good governance is important. But second is, if they get caught, they're subject to legal fees and affects their reputation. This has happened with a number of, most notably with Statoil in Iran 20 years ago. And so I think the transparency will improve the investment environment, especially for renewables. Just wishing for more investment in renewables is not going to happen. One of the things we need is an investment environment that will encourage private sector investment. And so I think that would make a huge difference. In countries where there's enough of civil society, it might also help in terms of better spending decisions, at least in terms of more difficulty in hiding corrupt decisions. I mean, there's some controversy about how much transparency helps, But even if people are most skeptical, think that it doesn't hurt, and it probably does help some. And I'm a business school professor, so I see things more from the private sector side. The companies are very, very leery, especially with the ESG issues and stuff, not just for their general reputation, but among investors. And so I think that could make a big difference. Again, no guarantee. In terms of derivatives, I can't remember exactly which of the small Caribbean microstates, but I think the Inter-American Development Bank has helped some of the Caribbean microstates in terms of hedging against oil price risk. I don't know which ones. Mexico, of course, is the most famous, but Mexico has a lot of technical capacity in the government. Mexico is the most common, but I also think you don't need that much technical capacity. That's where you rely on experts like, say, the IMF to help you. You don't need local financial markets. You need to say, all right, which investment banks around the world am I going to do the options with? And multilaterals can help in terms of making sure countries don't get ripped off. And so this is technical advice. And I think even if you don't have a stock market in your country, or you don't have a derivatives market, it isn't necessary. As far as I know, the main derivatives that are actually being used are over the counter with international parties. So I think that it's not going to solve everything, and nobody's going to suggesting you should hedge 100% of your production. But if you hedge some, it would help. Many years ago, I went to Alaska and to try to encourage Alaskans, because in some ways Alaska looks a lot like a Sub-Saharan African country in the amount of climate. They're totally dependent on natural resource revenues. And the Alaskans said, we didn't hedge our way to greatness. We produced our way to greatness. Thank you very much. And guess what? When the oil price crash came, they ended up with bridges to nowhere and unfinished hospitals and all that kind of thing. And so I was a little surprised that the REO sort of dismissed derivatives, as opposed to saying, well, some of these things are aspirational. Like, can we really target fuel subsidies? Very tough. I'm not sure that using derivatives or persuading people to use derivatives is tougher than targeting fuel subsidies. Neither of them are easy.
Wait, can I add something? I guess I just have to agree with Luke, not just because he's my division chief, but also because we actually looked into this, and I think one comment we made in the note is that given that these countries have shallow financial markets and have low risk management capacity, perhaps self-insurance is the option. That's what we deal with now. I mean, this doesn't exclude other instruments. So I don't think we have a huge disagreement here. It's just what is viable, what is realistic, what we can do now. I think basically self-insurance.
Great. Gentleman at the back here.
Moving slightly beyond the lens of your immediate study, but looking a little bit more at Africa in general. I think we would all acknowledge the difficulty of the climate transition. And I think the past few weeks, when you watched South Africa's discussions at the COP meeting in discussing the kind of package that it was going to be able to obtain on climate financing, whether it's going to be concessional loans, grants, commercial finance, etc., gives you a sense of the difficulty of this. And this is the 13th largest greenhouse gas emitter and a country that's almost entirely dependent on coal to power its economy and households. So, to my question, have you done any modeling in some of Africa's largest economies on the longer term fiscal path associated with the climate transition? And if so, what conclusions have you reached?
Okay, I think this is a very good question. You noted South Africa. South Africa is not one of the countries that is covered by our notes. But again, yes, the energy transition is challenging for all countries, including South Africa. One thing I could probably say here is that when we look at emitters, you highlight South Africa because this is the most the largest emitter in the region. But if you take South Africa out of the picture, then we're looking at a region that actually contributes the least to global emissions. We're looking at something probably less than 2%, or also, and I think last time I remember I looked into the data, I ranked emitters in the world, like different countries, and I wanted to compare between the highest and the lowest emitters, and I looked at least 25 countries in terms of emissions, and 23 out of 25 were actually Sub-Saharan African countries. So again, I'm just not skipping that question. I'm just saying South Africa is a different case. It's not something that we could generalize in the whole region. This is not to say that the energy transition is not challenging, it's not going to affect fiscal position of those countries. I mean, those countries, when they are dependent on fossil fuel, that we see it's coming, that at some point will be less important than they are today, then we obviously, it is going to head there in terms of the fiscal side, okay? And that may, cause uncertainty about revenue, also may cause debt sustainability issues. But again, it's just we didn't cover in the notes, but these are just a few thoughts I could share on the transition side.
Maybe I can answer to this question.
Yes.
About what
Regarding your question, we have not done really exactly simulation on that, but what we have done is a costing of adaptation costs for all African economies. So that part of the story, of course, is on the revenue side, but on the cost side, and we have found $30 to $50 billion per year of additional costs for African economies for adaptation in a real chapter in April 2020. So if you look at the April 2020 regional economic outlook, you have a chapter on climate, which look at the cost of climate adaptation. So it does not answer all your questions, but it's one dimension. And also this cost for climate is partly or perhaps mostly borne by the public sector, or perhaps also by the private, hopefully, but it's going to be a budgetary cost, I think.
Thank you. I wanted to take the moderator's prerogative of asking a question, which hopefully will end us on a somewhat optimistic note, which is the COP27 meetings that have been currently ongoing. There have been large numbers of statements and opinions and ideas raised during the meetings. And I was wondering if you saw any particular cause for optimism related to the green transition for the continent that have come out of the meetings being hosted on the continent, and whether or not we should have some strong cause for this.
I think, yeah, sharing your optimism, this has been called Africa COP. So, and the presidency of the conference, Egypt, where I come from, they actually have emphasized from day one that this is about implementation and bringing, pledges and commitment to actually doing actions. So I've heard a lot about different initiatives that again is to do with looking at how much more countries can do in terms in the context of different financial institutions, including the African Development Bank. And also one very important thing I think I could refer to, which make us more like optimism, is that those initiatives actually are aimed at encouraging the private sector to come and fill the gap. And because we have a huge financing gap. Okay, so we're talking about a promise of 100 billion per year. What has been delivered probably so far on average before the pandemic is about 70 billion per year. What goes to the region is about 1/4 of that. So the gap, the financing gap, is huge. And one way to actually overcome that is to create the environment that will encourage and facilitate the contribution of the private sector. I think this is something is actually being discussed at COP today, in addition to implementation and actions, and hopefully this is gonna take us toward that direction. And I think the IMF has some proposal on that, which is called blended finance, because the idea here is it is very risky for for private sector. There's lots of risk to take on, and also there's, as Professor Robert just highlighted, is that a lot of upfront investment needed. So if we have a partnership between public finance and private finance, also organized by also with the support of international financial institutions. So hopefully we can actually lower the risk, lower the entry barrier, and encourage more private money to come in to fill in the gap. It's a reason for optimism.
Good, pleased to hear that. Please join me in thanking our speakers for their remarks.